and welcome everyone to Auto-Classifying Files by Matter Name and Number. We have kind of a record crowd today and quite a large swath of people from law firms, from government agencies, from corporate legal departments, some consultants. So we're very excited to have you all, as Elise said. I'm going to be talking about auto-classification. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. We're going to start at the beginning and walk everybody through. If you're having any problems and you can't see the screen or something like that, please contact Elise and she will sort you out. Okay, let's dive in. So what is file classification? Basically, it is the creation of metadata about a file. Now, a lot of you know what metadata is. You're used to things like a file extension or a file name or a last modified date. Those are certainly metadata. But there are lots of other types of metadata that can be created about a file or about any kind of content, such as what are the key themes or the key words regarding that content, who wrote it, and for whom was it intended. These areas of metadata sometimes get short shrift because they're difficult to determine. If it were easy, we'd all be doing it. So a lot of systems either ask people to enter that information manually, or the kind of rise of auto-classification now to try and determine that programmatically. And that's the kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about today. What's commonly used, as I said, a couple of more familiar metadata types. There are also some emerging types of metadata. A big one is content sensitivity. That's things like, does this contain personally identifying information, or PII, things like a birth date or a social security number. There's another type of sensitivity too. Is it classified information, or maybe a trade secret or ultra trade secret? Different levels of content sensitivity will have different security measures around them, or they should. As I said, most systems, most programs will let you or a user or an administrator create metadata by hand. I don't know if any of you have done that, but I'm going to show you, and that's a little bit snarky on the bottom, actually how difficult this actually is. I'm going to attempt to add metadata to this PowerPoint presentation. So if you have never done this before, this is for you. It's actually quite difficult. First, you have to get out of the mode that I was in, because you can't do it while you're in a show mode. Then you have to go into your Windows Explorer, select Organize, Properties. Here's my file. Go into Details. Everybody still with me? Oh, whoops, I can't do it because I actually have it open. God forbid you should want to look at the actual content of a file while you're classifying it. That's not allowed. So you have to close that, close this, come back. I'm not kidding. I didn't make this up. You can thank Microsoft for this one. Okay. Then go to Details, and now you can add, you can see I added that at some point. This is my metadata title, and my comments. How annoying is this? Okay, I have now added metadata to that file. For most people, that is not a realistic approach to getting metadata about a file. Now, why do you need that? Because that is the way that documents are stored and organized. If you're using a document management system, many law firms out there are using something like eDocs or OpenText or WorkSite from iManage. If you're using one of those systems, they are storing and organizing your files by metadata. And generally they're asking you, the user, to sit down and create that metadata every single time you create a file. So that's when you create one from scratch, like a Word document, when you receive an email, when you send an email, and it's very, very tedious, as you just saw. To which we say, that doesn't seem very realistic, particularly in light of many firms who've been saving documents for decades. All of corporate America in the same exact boat. We have 20 years of stored information. Nobody is going to sit there and enter metadata by hand. And if they do, they're going to take the path of least resistance and enter the minimal amount they have to click through, or just select the very first drop down that comes up. Take a look sometime in your DMS systems how many things are stored in the A folder versus how many is stored in the Z folder. because that's one less step that everybody has to take. So why is this so hard? And the real reason is because it's not intuitive, it's not in the regular workflow, it's certainly not in the workflow that the majority of corporate America has been kind of brought up in. What we were taught and what we've done for decades is literally just create content and stick it somewhere. We really don't have the discipline to sit there and make metadata and to put files in the proper location. We don't even have access half the time. And so we've kind of evolved into this messy hodgepodge of data just kind of being stored randomly throughout most organizations. Again, ultimately people will take that path of least resistance. If the system will let you save a file without adding metadata, that's what everyone will do. If it forces you to add metadata, you're going to find that button that says something like inherit last file's metadata. Yeah, that sounds good, whether or not that has any bearing whatsoever to the current file. And this is the problem that contributes to the mess. It's sort of like having a library, which is supposed to use the Dewey Decimal System. Imagine if all of those Dewey Decimals were gone, and it was just literally a stack of books on the floor. That is effectively what we have done in corporate America and what we've done inside law firms. And what we're trying to get to is this concept of matter centricity. In other words, focusing all our content around client matter. That can be matter name, it can be matter number, it can maybe just be a client for simplicity, but the idea that that is an organizing principle for our data. Again, a good attempt and a good approach, but what it requires is many people to comply with that manual effort. So there is a better way. It's called AutoClassification, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It is software algorithms doing the work of creating that metadata, of classifying documents so that they have the right keywords and the right metadata, and then they're put in the right place. So it's a combination, and you'll hear me say this a lot throughout the hour, a combination of tagging, what is this thing and what do I know about it, and disposition, now that I know what it is, where do I put it? What do I do with it? You're going to hear that theme over and over. And AutoClassification is a much better option for any kind of large volume of data. Nobody wants to sit there and plow through 20 years of stored files. A common law firm variant of this problem is files for attorneys and staff who've left the firm. For whatever reason, they've retired, a whole bunch left to join another firm, maybe we divested a group, whatever it is, there are piles and piles and piles of sort of unmanned files, and the people who had all the knowledge about those files have left the building. And so the sort of departed employee problem is a big mess, and the good news is it's the perfect place to start thinking about auto-classification. One, it's usually a large volume of data. Two, it doesn't belong to anybody. Three, anybody who is still there certainly doesn't want to have to deal with someone who's left, deal with all of their files. And four, those files are not typically in active use. So they represent a good starting point for auto-classification because you're not really impacting the day-to-day staff person. You're dealing with the mess that nobody wanted to touch. So that's a little bit of a hint for all of you, kind of evaluating auto-classification. An excellent place to start is with departed attorney emails and files. The other reason that auto-classification is a huge win over the manual approach, in addition to the pain aspect, is that it is consistent. So software is always going to analyze files the exact same way every time. They're gonna classify this matter to be, the Smith-Jones matter and belongs in this folder exactly the same whether it's Monday or Friday or this month or last month or 6 years ago or 6 years from now. They use consistent algorithms. People are not very consistent. We're certainly not consistent with each other, and very often not even with ourselves. And so again, that makes file organization and file recovery very, very difficult. Auto-classification is a good solution for that. And then finally, there are whole classes of files that are fairly sensitive, might contain employee information like a social security number or perhaps a pay scale. These are not things that should be just open to everybody. I won't name names, but a large law firm that we're aware of has everybody's I-9 information open to everybody in the firm. If you're not familiar, the I-9 is what you use to prove your identity, that you are hireable in the United States. So that might include a picture of your driver's license or your social security card or your passport. Okay, these documents are sort of open season and really should not be. Sensitive information should be auto-classified so that people aren't in there looking at that sensitive information. So Elise, I'll stop here. That was a lot of ground. See if we have any questions so far.
I do have a question. How often should a drive or repository be indexed for new content?
That is a great question. And there's a couple of schools of thought there. In my opinion, it should be pretty regular, as in several times a day. There are other schools of thought that suggest that you should batch things up and then do it, say, once a month or something like that. Ultimately, it comes down to a question of A, how frequently is new content occurring? And B, how up to date does it need to be when you need to use it? So even if you only use it once a quarter, but you need the data to be accurate at that time, you had better run right before your usage scenario. Most things that we see, to be perfectly honest with you, we tend to update every 5 minutes. It's not a big hassle on any of the systems. 5 minutes is a long time in computer processing power, and that tends to be fast enough to keep things up to date, but slow enough that it's not putting any kind of burden on anybody. So that kind of out of the gate with no further information, that would be our suggestion, is roughly every 5 minutes. Okay, let's move ahead. So what is auto-classification that I keep talking about? It is distinctly not going out of PowerPoint, entering something through Windows Explorer. It's definitely not that. Okay, it's computer software that's running in the background and that has been custom configured to a particular environment. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're a large law firm and it has been configured to match your matters, your staff, your workflow. Maybe you're not a law firm. Maybe you're a real estate, investment trust. Then it's been tuned to your environment for the types of documents that you would expect in that environment. The best auto-classification systems do have a kind of custom configuration aspect to them. When you buy something straight off the shelf, it tends to be kind of lowest common denominator for obvious reasons, and that makes the recognition weak to any particular area. So if you really want to fly with auto-classification, you want it to be custom configured to your environment. That's a combination of your workflow, your kind of information lists, we'll get to that in a minute, and your document types. So the software contains recognition algorithms for the basic elements of what constitutes a document or a file. The linchpin to all of this is document type. And I don't mean, .xls or .PDF. That's a file extension. I mean literally document type, like a letter or a motion in limine or a cash flow statement. That's what we mean by document type. And the software can usually recognize, thousands of document types. And that's really key because not every kind of data element is going to be present in every type of document. So if you take something like a letter on letterhead, obviously you would expect a recipient and an author and probably a date and probably a subject line. You're not going to see that kind of thing if you're in a cash flow statement. You might have an author. You probably don't have a recipient. You probably have a fairly detailed title that's going to include key elements of a date. You don't have a cash flow statement in isolation. It concerns a period of time. And so the document type helps dictate the kinds of information that are available inside that document. That's sort of that direction. It also works in a self-reinforcing way in the other direction, which is if you have kind of telltale data elements in some content, it can help you determine what the document type is. And I'll give an example. For anybody who might have been employed, let's say, before the year 2000, you would see this phrase all the time, which is, if this transmission was received in error, please contact. Okay, that's what we call a ringer. It's a ringer to say it's a fax cover sheet. We don't see that too much today, but it's still my example of a kind of ringer phrase that pretty much doesn't appear anywhere else that helps dictate that I'm dealing with a fax or a communication of some kind. So the auto-classification software is typically set up as middleware. In other words, it kind of lives between where the files currently live, probably in a somewhat disorganized state. They might be on an archive somewhere. They might be floating around an email server and lots of custodian files. They might be on desktops or even on phones. That's the sort of starting location. Then comes, in our case, Powerhouse, which is the classification engine. And then after that is the location where you'd like the documents ultimately to live. Some sort of document management system, or DMS. If you're using iManage or you're using OpenText, that's what the DMS is. And so Powerhouse typically sits between where things live currently, does its fancy tagging and placement, and then puts them where they need to go into the DMS. That's not universally true. Sometimes things are just coming out of a DMS, getting all their beautiful classification, and then being put back, but in a different place. I mean, obviously it depends on the circumstance. Valora's classification engine is called Powerhouse. I'll be using that term throughout, so in case you're wondering what that is, it's our auto classification. Elise, why don't I stop here? Any other questions come up?
Okay, I think you spoke to some of this, but I wanted to make sure the question was heard. Does the classification engine require full and accurate uh, textual representation of the documents being classified? For example, scanned documents and files saved to PDF from many applications do not have full and accurate text.
Okay, sure. That is absolutely correct. And no, it doesn't have to be full and or particularly accurate. It has to be passable. That is, you know, to, let's say, a human eye, that you could actually look at it and understand what this is. So I'm going to talk briefly for 1 second about handwritten documents. They do not make a good text rendition. So they really are not a choice for auto classification. Handwritten documents generally need to be managed by hand. But as long as something is typeset in its origin, and that can very well include a scanned paper document, an image of a printout basically, what happens is we run OCR, optical character recognition, on those images, those scanned images, whether PDF, TIFF, JPEG, whatever you got. And then a text rendition of that document is used to do all the automation. And for native files, a text extraction process, similar to what goes on in e-discovery, if you're familiar with that. Oops, I was muted for a second. Sorry about that. The text rendition that comes from a native file, we would use that too. One way or another, we do have to get to text, but it certainly doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be, let's just say, super accurate. It has to be sort of baseline accurate. So I'll call it there. Okay. The content analytics aspect, what I'm just describing, that's literally text analytics and other things as well, are exceptionally strong at determining things like matter name and matter number. I'm actually going to walk you through that in a moment. Very easy to classify and to determine these types of data elements from a file. So some of these are more in the tagging category, in other words, just pure extraction of information like client name or jurisdiction. And some are a little bit more in the disposition category. In other words, what do I do about it? What we at Valora would call rules. So the first one would be tagging and the second would be rules. Things like recommended file location, that's going to be a rule. It's going to interpret everything that's been determined about the document so far and use that to essentially make a statistically probable guess about where that file should live. So I'm going to walk you through that in just a sec. Okay, A quick trip though, just to see the architecture of Powerhouse and BlackCat, because I'm going to throw these terms around a lot, and you should probably understand kind of what's underneath. So at the very bottom we have a SQL Server layer. You can think of what Valora is doing as almost a metadata database. We're not really storing the documents per se, we're storing information about the documents. Some people have described this as gene sequencing the documents, others as creating a digital fingerprint of the document. I like both of those metaphors. And it is the fingerprint or gene sequencing data that lives in the database, not the document itself, that lives in the DMS. So sitting on top of the SQL server is the Powerhouse server. And Powerhouse is essentially doing all the heavy lifting about automation. That's what's happening over here on the left. So if we need to create an OCR text rendition, it will do that there. Some other things that Powerhouse will do right at the intake point. Let's say the file was originally in Chinese or Spanish. It's going to automatically translate that into English. If you've ever used Google Translate, you know very much how that works. In fact, it's the exact same engine. And yes, because someone will ask, it's a custom license for Valora. It is not going over the internet. So something like that. We might do some auto redaction at the front end if there's sensitive information. There's lots of different auto processes that happen right in the beginning. Then comes the kind of rules assessment. All right, I know what this is. I've extracted out all this incredible information. Now I'm going to use that to make a determination about this file. And then it's going to go ahead and place the file where it needs to go. The other pieces of Powerhouse that are here, there's kind of an administrative console. This might be for the IT department or whoever it is that's responsible for this system. And there's what we call a QC user interface for any documents that might show up as an exception. I mentioned handwriting earlier. Occasionally, a document, for whatever reason, will be ambiguous as to what it is or where it needs to go, and that'll be considered an exception. This is a mechanism for dealing with exceptions. Exceptions are typically under 0.5% of a population, so it usually is quite a small number. Those can either be managed by Valora, they can be managed by you and your team, they can even be managed by a third party if that's something you want to do. And then sitting on top of Powerhouse is BlackCat, what we call the presentation layer. In other words, how do we serve up the information that we know about all of these documents? Yes, you have your DMS, but that's kind of a flat file folder structure. What BlackCat does is do all kinds of sexy kind of visualization, data visualization, charts and graphs and who talks to who and what's the most common topic and where do I find docs of this nature. You'll see that in a bit. We're going to do just a quick overview of BlackCat. If that interests you, of course, contact Elise and we will set up a BlackCat demo for you. And now if you want, this was the kind of easy architecture diagram. If we have any AP students in the class, this is structurally what's going on. Basically focus on the pink layer. What's happening is that Powerhouse goes behind the firewall and is polling these various sources of files and information. It might be your Exchange email server, it might be SharePoint, wherever it is, it might be your desktop, where the files live in their kind of unenhanced state. And it comes down through, does all kinds of Powerhouse fancies, and comes back out and then is put in the right place with the right data attached. And so long as these systems can inherit all this rich metadata, we're in good shape. If the systems cannot inherit that data, that's where BlackCat comes into play, which makes full use of all that rich metadata and to allow end users to kind of manipulate that. I'll show you that as we get closer. Why don't I stop here, Elise? That was a lot of architecture goo. Any questions?
Okay, sorry about that. I had muted myself. Should old content be reclassified to determine if it should be classified according to a different category?
That's a very good question. In general, I would say yes. You want all of your content to kind of be subservient to the same rules, because otherwise you have kind of different fiefdoms that may or may not play well together. I would recommend reclassifying things. That being said, a good classification engine should be able to inherit the properties of prior efforts. This is again where some of that custom configuration comes into play. So if there was a thoughtful approach once upon a time, whether it was manually done or done with some sort of classification agent, the newer models like Powerhouse should be able to inherit the rules or the techniques that were used before by analyzing the already classified documents and essentially creating a rule base to match. So that's something you definitely want to look for. If you have some documents that have been classified, sometimes organizations have things, just the high priority ones, the contracts or something like that, or you have one, let's say one attorney who's just super about, adding metadata and classifying, they become the test case. All of that is really good and really useful. A system like Powerhouse will actually look at that and inherit the logic that's been utilized before. So that was a great question. Okay, so how does it actually work? I've been tossing around a couple of terms. The very first step is processing. In other words, the files have to come into Powerhouse at least temporarily. I mentioned a couple of these earlier. One way or another, Powerhouse needs some text. And so if it's a native file, we're going to do text extraction. If it's a scanned image, we're going to do OCR. If it's something that actually doesn't have text initially, let's say it's an audio or a video file, let's say it's a recording of a conference call, or it's a newscast, something like that, we're going to run speech to text. It's a lot like OCR, which is image to text. This is speech sound to text. And we're going to produce some text. And if the text wasn't English to start, we're going to change it into English. And then anything else fancy that needs to happen at the point of intake is going to happen at that time. So here's just a quick visual. So let's say we're starting out with a PDF. Maybe it was a scanned PDF. Maybe somebody made a PDF but somehow didn't have text. The PDF exists in a lot of different forms if you didn't know that. A quick way to check if you ever want to do it is kind of click and drag over your PDF image. If it looks like lines and bars, then you have text underneath. If it's just like kind of a plus and making a big open rectangle, then you don't. So just FYI. So we basically go one way or another from PDF to text, and that would be English text. Then we go to the tagging step. Tagging is that kind of gene sequencing, fingerprinting that goes on, where we're extracting out or determining critical metadata. And just so people understand, most people think there's like 3 or 4 fields of metadata. Valora is creating or extracting about 600 fields. And they contain everything you see here and many, many more. Depending on what the documents are, what we think we'll need to perform rules down the line, and what is of interest to the organization that we're working with. So, for example, for some organizations, brand names might be absolutely critical. For a law firm, it might very well be client name or, judge or witness name. Whatever it is that we need to extract to be able to utilize down the line, we're going to pull out at this stage, tagging. And that's where we're going to go from text to essentially that field database. That remember that SQL layer, this is all the fingerprinting information for each piece of content. I won't even say document or file because it could be a tweet. So I'll say piece of content. Okay. So that's all taking place inside Powerhouse. And here's how it is kind of functionally working. So let's say we have an email from Stuart Trumbull, a partner at a very impressive law firm, and he is sending an email to, let's say, his legal assistant. Okay, so this email, there's a lot of pieces of data in this email, and Powerhouse is going to pull out all of them. First thing it's going to see, author. Okay, that was an easy one. It's metadata, it's an email, big deal, Sandy. It's also going to validate that, okay, because this is his V card or his signature line. And so we're able to validate things like S. Trumbull is in fact Stuart Trumbull and his title, he's a partner. Not only that, his office and cell phone number. So if we ever see this cell phone number anywhere else in the population, we know who that is. It's actually my cell phone number if you want to call it and say hello, but I borrowed it for Stuart here. Some other things that Powerhouse is recognizing, okay? And now this is where we get into that classification by matter aspect. It recognizes this phrase, Passaro matter. It also recognizes the matter number. Okay, that's a double ringer, right? They're reinforcing each other. Okay? It's also finding that there's another document affiliated with this email. It's an attachment. Okay, and what we would call an implied attachment range. In other words, these two documents belong together. One is transmitting the other. And while they might have importance on their own, we should not lose the fact that they someone, the author of this, intended for these documents to be affiliated with one another. And so this attachment here, okay, not only is it sort of connected to the parent email, we also know something about it. It says, please file this motion in limine. Well, which thing on here do you think is the motion in limine? It's that PDF, of course. And so we now have kind of a doc type clue on this PDF. Now Powerhouse is going to go in there and use the text and determine for sure that it's a motion in limine. But this is kind of corroborating evidence that both ties them together and helps promote the confidence about each one. So Powerhouse is going to go through all of this and plenty more and eventually come up with the implied matter. So the orange is that tagging step, tag, 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 and then the blue is the rule engine. So the rule engine looks at both the content itself and all that delicious metadata that we've captured and goes, aha, I know with, reasonable or acceptable confidence that this belongs in Passaro. And so I'm going to tag it as such, and then assuming this is what the client wants us to do, I'm going to move this content to that folder. Okay, so that's how kind of email classification works. Let's look at something harder. Let's say the attachment was a patent application. What is this? Okay, so Powerhouse goes hog wild, pulling out data elements everywhere it can find them. And these are just things that I thought of off the top of my head. Half the time we suggest to clients, hey, do you need to know the abstract? We will suggest things to them, and half the time they will come to us and say, hey, can you, typical example, I got one this morning, hey, can you determine, the retention policy if it indicates it in the content? Yeah, of course, if it's present. And, we have a discussion with you about how you might know that that's what it was. And so just to indicate that that's some give and take that goes on between provider and client. Again, this isn't something you just kind of buy off the shelf, plug in, and walk away. There has to be a little bit of give and take, and you can see why that would be so. Elise, actually, why don't I stop here in case there are questions, because I've covered a lot of classification ground.
So let's see, I have a couple here. What happens in the real world when things change? For example, a new company is acquired and a whole new set of records need to be ingested and integrated, or a new federal regulation causes a rewriting of many form documents.
Okay, so that is a great question. They're actually different. So I'll take the second one first, which is what happens when the documents themselves have to change. The good news is that Powerhouse is using essentially statistical pattern matching to determine these things. So it doesn't much matter where they are on the page or if they've changed locations or gotten longer or shorter. So in other words, let's just say for some reason assignee was critical from these documents. If this was now over here or there were 16 assignees, Powerhouse is going to get that anyway because it's pattern matching. So that's sort of scores one for Valora's technique. An older, much older technique of doing this was called forms recognition or rubber banding. Some of you may know what that is, where these systems were only looking in a specific place on the document. That's a very dangerous technique. The minute that content moves for whatever reason, those systems fail. That is not how Powerhouse works. As I said, it's pattern matching. So, have at it. Change the document. That's very common. And since we tend to be looking across time, sometimes decades, of course the content changes, format, location, things like that. So the system's really robust with that. Now I'll take the first question, which was, what happens when whole new classes of documents enter the system? And in that case, there's going to probably be a little bit of a reconfiguration or a tuning effort. These systems, just so everyone knows, these systems can kind of go out of tune over time, much like a piano. And that is because we do kind of change the way we speak sometimes. We have new kinds of things that come up that didn't exist before. We might acquire another entity and inherit all of their data. So there's usually some sort of a reconfiguration effort that will take place there. In general, Valora does a tuning effort once a quarter anyway. It's built into our pricing. It's almost seamless to the client unless there's something major, where we're just checking performance and saying, are we still doing as strong a job, or has anything gone out of tune? Just kind of watching that and tuning. And that's typically the moment or the opportunity where there's something drastic where we will be engaged with the client and we'll do a little bit more of just simple tuning. We'll actually do a little bit of reconfiguration at that point. It's certainly manageable and doable, but everyone has to be a little bit aware that that's taking place. To be honest with you, if the client did not tell us that that occurred and all of a sudden there were a gazillion new documents, we would know pretty quickly because the confidences wouldn't be as strong and we would recognize that something had changed. So probably we'd be making that phone call and going, something you want to tell us? Okay, so here's what it looks like. We have sort of Powerhouse. Remember, Powerhouse is that middleware between the before and the after. So here's the before. There's a lot of different ways that documents can get into Powerhouse. If you just have a few documents here and there, you can just drag them in through a secure portal, or users can do that automatically by themselves. We also have more typically, what we would do is pull a shared server. In other words, this might be your email, your Exchange server. This might be an older DMS that you're migrating away from. It might just be Windows Explorer, where we're going to go in and basically take the digital equivalent of this and format it and do all this, delicious stuff to it, all of these things. And then things are going to come out into either or both of a kind of hosted data visualization type scenario. This is BlackCat, or into an organized folder taxonomy. This might be iManage or OpenText, maybe SharePoint itself, where each document is going to be placed in the right location with all the right metadata. And then finally, as a kind of go forward, because as I said, these systems can get out of tune, there's often an integration with some back-end systems so that we're not having to reinvent the wheel every day. I will walk you through that in a second. So here's what a typical portal might look like. Users can literally just click and drag and drop, and drop files right on into Powerhouse. There are a couple of other intake methods. You can have an automatic email bounce, similar to what many organizations do with legal hold, where you're actually mailing to, you might be mailing to somebody, but you're CCing the legal hold. Very often people will CC Powerhouse, and the documents and the transmission email will automatically all come in as you saw earlier. Another technique, again, depending where the documents are and where the Powerhouse system lives, you could use secure FTP, and you could use the direct server poll, which is by and large the typical way. So normally we would do a live demo here. We don't really have time for this today, but obviously if you want to see Powerhouse live, you have a couple of options. One, of course, contact us. Two, we have our nifty new YouTube channel, and you can go take a look at that. If you search on Valora Technologies on YouTube, you will see all our videos, including a live demo of Powerhouse. In the meantime, I'm going to move ahead and get to the kind of advanced placement stuff related to Powerhouse. So I've mentioned a couple times inputs. So Powerhouse does its recognition. Um, it does it on its own, but it can also incorporate input from other systems or lists of data or previously categorized work. We talked about that one earlier. So there are a couple of inputs that go into Powerhouse. Of course, they are the files themselves. These are the ones that are to be classified. Then there is what I would call guidance information. If you have retention policies or definitions of your security levels, if you have different workflow criteria, this is how we store documents for a case matter. Guidance information. And then also what I would call update lists. So these are lists of already established information that Powerhouse can use as a kind of input mechanism, like here's a list of all our clients, or here's a list of all our staff. Those are very helpful for Powerhouse in determining, oh, there's Joe Smith who works here, and there's Joe Smith who's a client. Who's who? Okay, that can be really useful input values. And rather than sitting there and having to, create the list over and over and over, we've built Powerhouse to automatically integrate with systems like SAP or Serengeti or things like that, or other maybe Oracle systems, to be able to pull those systems and pull, give me a list of all the clients from the billing database, or give me a list of everything from the docket database, so that we can automatically do this. I'll show you a little bit how both of those work. So, okay. So here's the manual approach. Okay, I'm ready. Let's get Powerhouse rolling. Here's a list of our clients. Or here's a nice little table by matter name, matter number, who's the client, who's opposing, who are, our key personnel, blah, 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 blah. If you have this in a kind of tabular format, fantastic. You're way ahead of the game. And by the way, if you don't have this, that's okay. Powerhouse will actually generate this by parsing through all the content. It will effectively create this database one way or another. It'll either create it from scratch, or it'll use your input, this file, as a starting point. So whether you have nothing at your disposal or you have the world's most sophisticated systems at your disposal, we're going to be able to integrate with you one way or another. Another example might be, here's a list of staff. Okay, here's the attorney, their hire date, whatever else you want that might be helpful to Powerhouse. So this is what I say the manual approach. Again, depending on the rate of change in your organization, how often do you add a new matter number, how often do you add or dismiss an employee, is going to determine the frequency needed of these files. If that's not an everyday occurrence, it's a once-a-month occurrence, by all means, generate the file manually. If it's happening every 5 minutes because you're a global AmLaw 20 firm and you have 5 people departing and joining every minute of the day, probably you're not going to do this by hand. Instead, remember this picture, we're going to look down here now. Okay, you're going to do it like this. Here's an SAP automatic query. Okay, and this is what it looks like to you, the human being. To Powerhouse, it's just numbers and digits. It's querying SAP probably every day, just to keep current, to say, give me your current list, give me your current list. It's a small deal. SAP and other systems like that are quite used to being queried. They're built for that. And so it's a small deal for Powerhouse to come along and go, hey, can you give me some info? You'll see that with billing systems, HR systems, conflicts databases, even docket databases. Here's an example. Here's an HR system being queried. Here's a conflicts database being queried. And here's a docket, kind of an automated docket being queried. So again, just to give you a feel for, let me go back up, for what this little layer down here looks like. So either those systems, if they're sophisticated enough, can just push that information to Powerhouse on a regular basis, or if the preference is for Powerhouse to query them, what we call pulling or even polling them on a regular basis, just like it's polling the storage files, say, hey, any new email, any new client matter info, it's going to also poll those kind of input databases just to see if anything has changed that it should know about in its rules engine. Okay, before I get to this, Elise, I'm probably at a good stopping point for questions.
Yeah, a few came in as
Okay, I assume this is somebody asking things like Apple, 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 where you have, Apple the fruit, Apple the company, Apple, Fiona Apple. Basically, Powerhouse is a little bit more sophisticated than that. It's not necessarily looking at a single word that way. It's looking at all kinds of formatting. So, for example, is Apple capitalized? Is it capitalized in the middle of a sentence? Probably that's more of an indicator that we're talking about Apple the company. We're also looking for a lot of corroborating evidence. A single instance of a word, kind of miscellaneous word in the middle of content, is not a very strong indicator. Whereas, an email to Steve Jobs at apple.com is a much, much stronger indicator. Powerhouse does not look at those two instances of the letters APPLE the same way. That's part of the reason we're doing that tagging step in the beginning, because tagging data is very, very strong and can generally be relied upon to be kind of a strong positive indicator, a confidence builder on content. Very different than just casual text mention. And so Powerhouse is constantly weighting all of the different kind of data elements that it has come across, and it's using all of these to help corroborate and push the confidence up over the mark that says, yes, essentially we confidently believe that it is Apple the company. If that determination can't be made, then that file is specifically flagged for exception handling, because there is something about it that is too ambiguous or too many counterexamples that the software is essentially uncomfortable. I mean, I'm anthropomorphizing, but you get the point, that it is not a strong enough weighting to push it over. So that is one way that we handle vocabulary ambiguity. There's also ways to have different weightings. Much like Google, if you've ever done a Google search, if you search for, what is the capital of Massachusetts, and then you just type in what capital Massachusetts, you will get the same results. So we're letting go a lot of kind of lower value words, is, the, of, at. That's automatically out of the gate. As we go through, I mean, again, one of the things that we do here is we are testing this. We don't just push it out and go, here you go, have a nice day. We want the system to be performing very highly before it ever hits your premise. So we are testing for other things. Are there words that are confusing it? Are there words that belong on the do not consider list, even though in normal English they would be, but in this client scenario, they're confusing the system or they're of low value? So we have the ability to kind of manipulate the systems that way for optimal performance. Were there other questions, Elise?
Yes, as you were talking, another one came in. I have a few more too, but we can hold those for the next break. Question is, can end user involvement be eliminated in regards to manual type?
That is the question of the day. Yes, that is exactly the point. I cringe whenever I hear about or I see end users having to enter in manual metadata. It's just wrong. It's just wrong from top to bottom. And so the Powerhouse system assumes that users will not need to do that. They have the ability to overwrite if they have permission to do so. Certainly the system will permit it if they have the right access. Um, and for exception handling, yes, you want somebody to kind of look at that. But other than those scenarios, so we're talking about 99.95% of the time, the system does the metadata by itself. No end user involvement required. Okay, I will jump over at this point to some timeline expectations. There's really kind of three phases of this kind of work. I've talked a lot today about configuration and setup. That is actually occurring at Valora typically, where we are configuring the system just for you. We're aware of the kinds of documents you have. We're aware of the kinds of input systems you have, and we are aware of the types of documents that you have. Now, some documents are universal. Everybody's got email. But you'd be surprised how much variability there really is, and we will always try to optimize that for a client to the extent that we have access to it a priori. So this effort, when I say SME, that's a subject matter expert. At some point, we will need to interact with somebody at the client site who is an expert and who can answer questions like, how would you disambiguate between document A and document B? What's different? Why do you like document A and dislike document B? Help us understand. So there's that kind of give and take dialogue. It's typically no more than a half an hour, maybe once or twice during the duration of this effort. But it is somebody that you should kind of have in mind who's going to be that point person for us if we're working with you. Phase 2 is what we would call the back file. In other words, that's the accumulated pile of stuff. That's the last 10 years of email messages sitting out on your archive email server that really need to just be classified. Nobody wants to take that on. Nobody wants to deal. And we're just going to pound through that at what I call peak utilization. I get questions from time to time, how many servers does this require and what kind of, hardware environment? This is where it's going to be the most utilization of effort. For anybody out there that's a little bit technical, this is a completely virtualized scenario. So figure roughly 1 or 2 servers and on the order of 6 to 20 VMs. Again, depending on how much you want that peak to be. Do you want to go through 100,000 files every minute or 100 million? Okay, that is really up to the client. Powerhouse can certainly handle it either way. It really just is a function of how much is there and how quickly do we want to get through it all. There will be some interaction with your IT team for sure, because this is when we're bringing the system on site and hooking it in. So we'll just want to make sure that everybody's copacetic with what's going on. They will not need to be involved for 2 to 4 months straight, not even close, just a little bit probably at the beginning and occasionally points throughout. And then comes phase 3, which is the ongoing. And the nice thing is the difference between phase 2 and phase 3 is almost invisible to everybody, because once we're up and running and we're pounding through all those stored documents and putting them in the right place, phase 3, the only difference is that the actual volume of material is much less, because it's for all the files that continue to be created each day, all the email you receive today, tomorrow, the next day, and you and everybody else in your organization. So it's much lower volume activity. So one nice thing that most IT groups appreciate is if we're going to go into peak mode, it's only for a limited window. It's not something that has to become a permanent fixture in your organization. We can even schedule these to run on holidays, nights, weekends to take advantage of utilization and be smart about that. But once that back file is complete, we go into ongoing mode, and Powerhouse just does its thing on every new file as it gets created. Again, almost seamless to everybody involved, including IT at that point. So that's a little bit what the timeline and the sequence of events looks like. I've got one more sort of slide here, then we can jump back into questions. They've all been excellent. And that is how to get started with this. And basically, most folks already have this first step. They are already pulling their hair out with file classification because it is a major drag. People don't do it. They hate it. It's just a major frustration point. So if you have to actually ask yourself this question, you may not be in as desperate a situation as others. But one suggestion that I have for all of you is to look for what I call a precipitating event, something that is going to kick this into high prominence. It might be that it's time to migrate data from one system to another, or your email server, your DMS is forcing an upgrade on you. Whenever you have that, I need to move massive piles of files from one thing to another, that's a really good time to get your house in order. Start classifying, start putting things in the right place. Don't just do a dumb copy from your old system to your new system. That's a huge mistake. Whenever you have a large number of people coming or going, that's a very good time as well, because people are paying attention to that. You are going to have budget for that. This does not happen by accident. This is by design, and so this would be part of the systems in that design. And then finally, now is a really good time. We're in September. Most firms are having their budgetary planning for 2017 in the kind of September, October time frame. Get auto classification on the agenda. It is a hot, hot, hot topic for 2017. It's all I hear about. So if you or your colleagues are involved in this, now's a very good time to kind of get auto classification on the map with your organization. Just some notes for you. And basically, don't be shy in contacting us. Even if you don't have a project right away, it's okay. Go ahead and call us. We want to be there to help you. We are as much about promoting auto classification as we are necessarily having Valora be the solution. We've done a lot of this, and we know a lot. So go ahead and give us a call, and we will help you through. All right, Elise, what do you got?
Question. How do I deal with conflicting categories with regards to auto classification?
Okay, I think what that means is that essentially the categories overlap. They are not mutually exclusive. That is a tricky problem. In general, we try to be as mutually exclusive as we possibly can because you don't want Powerhouse to get confused underneath and do the wrong thing. Sometimes that's inevitable, and there are ways to deal with that. Sometimes a document will either show up in two folders, or one is the actual and one's a pointer. It doesn't have to be singly universal throughout. We would want to make sure that the rules engine itself is distinct so that it doesn't crisscross and make a mistake. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the files can't exist in multiple locations. They can, and Powerhouse will track that. So part yes to that answer, part no.
How long should ongoing management take once the taxonomy is in place?
So once the taxonomy is in place and tested and all of that, you're in very good shape. The ongoing management is that tuning effort. We typically figure 3 or 4 hours per quarter, and that's on Valora's effort. The client's effort is probably maybe half an hour a quarter. It's a small deal unless there's some massive precipitating event like you're acquiring another firm. Okay, yeah, that's going to take a little more effort. But just day to day, kind of keep it going, now's the next quarter, tra-la-la. I would say half an hour tops on the part of the client.
Okay, I think that is it for questions.
Okay. I'm just going to kind of close this out because we're coming up on the hour. Elise and I will stick around for additional questions, or if people have comments, we of course encourage you to contact us. We'd love to know what you thought about this presentation, and of course if you have an auto classification need, we'd love to help you. So basically this is typically who we work with, and here's who we are. Again, I would direct you to our website, which is valoratech.com, and to our YouTube channel, and hopefully you'll learn a lot about us. And thank you all for joining us today.